So our next speaker, Lena Verscht, is going to tell us about many Hoare-Like logics. So,
exactly. Yes, hi everyone. I'm Lena. I'm presenting joint work with Benjamin Kaminski at Saarland University on and what we want to do is we want to build a taxonomy of program logics. And when I say program logics, I mean, for example, Hoare logic or incorrectness logic, which is also reverse Hoare logic. Then Lisbon logic has been mentioned in literature recently. Just to name a few, there are many, many, many more. So the goal of this talk basically will be to bring some structure into this picture. So what we can observe first is that many of these are actually equivalent, but there are more relations between them that we're going to try to structurally examine. So as I said, the objective will try to build a taxonomy, and the formal frameworks that we're going to use are predicate transformers mainly, and we're also going to take a quick look at Kleene algebra, or a variant of Kleene algebra. But I'm going to start with predicate transformers, in particular with the weakest precondition transformer, which takes as input some non-deterministic program P and some set of final states, so the postcondition here in blue C, and computes some set of initial states. Now, there are different variants of weakest precondition transformers, different sets of initial states. So let's first take a look at what kind of initial states are there, or what can happen in an initial state. For example, computation can terminate in the postcondition, or it can terminate outside of the postcondition. Then we have non-deterministic choices. So it can also be that the computation either diverges, which is the spiral thing, or terminates in the postcondition, and this black box that you're seeing represents a non-deterministic choice in the program. And of course, the same can happen outside of the postcondition, and it can also be that computation terminates in C or outside of C, and of course, it can also be the case that computation from an initial state always diverges. But that's it. So this gives us 7 classes of initial states, so to speak. And the different weakest pre variants contain different parts of, so to speak. So the first one that we're going to look at is the demonic weakest pre transformer, which only contains this first class. So this requires all paths that are starting in this set of states to terminate in the postcondition. The angelic weakest pre transformer only requires the existence of a path to the postcondition. So when I say angelic, demonic, you can think of there exists a path versus something has to hold for all paths. And well, we want to build program logics, right? So let's take a look at how we do this. And it's quite simple, actually. We just take a precondition, B, and require it to be included, for example, in the demonic weakest precondition, which gives us total correctness Hoare logic. And if we do the same for the angelic weakest pre, this gives us Lisbon logic. Then there are also liberal variants of these transformers. And liberal basically means that they allow divergence. So for example, the demonic weakest liberal pre does not require computation to terminate, but if it does, it has to do so in the postcondition. And the angelic weakest liberal pre only requires the existence of either a diverging path or a path terminating in the postcondition. And well, we can add them here. If we under-approximate the demonic weakest liberal pre, we get partial correctness Hoare logic. And for the angelic variant, we get some angelic variant of partial correctness. And let's take one final look at this picture here, because what we can see quite nicely is that there is a relation between these transformers, because you see the demonic weakest pre, the bottom row, is contained in these 2 transformers in the middle. And these are incomparable, but they are in turn contained in the angelic weakest liberal pre. And this directly translates to an order of implication between these logics that we've defined using the transformers. Then there is this quite well-known equivalence between weakest pre and strongest post, because we can express partial correctness Hoare logic using weakest pre transformers, but also using so-called strongest post transformers. So we're now going to take a closer look at those. So here's the picture that we had before. The weakest pre are backward transformers. They are starting with some initial states and computing, starting with final states, computing initial states. And now we're going to do the opposite. So we're going to start with initial states, compute some set of final states. So the direction of this program is now from bottom to top. Okay, and now what do these arrows mean in this case? Well, the first one, the one on the left, is just a final, or, represents a final state that is just reachable from the precondition B and from the precondition only. A bit more interesting, this diverging, or what was a diverging path. Well, what is a diverging path? It's basically an execution started in an initial state that is leading to nowhere. So the dual thing is kind of a final state where execution is coming from nowhere. So there's no initial state that can reach this final state. So this final state is unreachable. And to distinguish this, we're going to use these arrows coming from nowhere to visualize unreachability. Then we had these non-deterministic choices, these boxes, which were, well, representing like a path started in an initial state that branches into computation paths leading to different final states. But now these are just two computations that are, it's like a confluence of paths, which is not necessarily caused by a non-deterministic choice in the program, right? This can simply be caused by a statement which is not reversible. So I'm going to remove this box because there's not necessarily a non-deterministic choice present here. Okay, and now take a look at this second arrow. I said divergence is dual to unreachability. So what this would be is like a final state that is both unreachable and also reachable from the precondition, which in the setting of program analysis, this does not make any sense, right? And the same actually holds for all of these paths where we have a branching of divergence. So we can actually just remove them here from the picture because they do not exist. And this leaves us with only 4 different classes of final states, so to speak. And we're going to use them now to build strongest postcondition transformers. So this is the direction of this picture is reversed again. So we have initial states on top and the final states on bottom. And we have these 4 classes that we've just seen. And now we're going to define the strongest post variants. And we're going to start with a new one, which is the demonic strongest post transformer. The standard strongest post transformer is an angelic one. Why angelic? Well, the angelic strongest post contains all states that are reachable from the precondition B. Or in other words, there exists a path coming from the precondition. The demonic strongest post requires that all paths were coming from the precondition. And maybe you remember this is very similar to the weakest pre case. Just now these differentiation is not caused by non-deterministic choices, but by irreversible statements. And let's take a look at our picture. So we've had an over-approximation of the angelic strongest post already. If we under-approximate this, we get incorrectness logic. If we under-approximate the demonic strongest post, we get some demonic variant of incorrectness, which requires kind of exclusive reachability from the precondition. And now, as for the weakest pre-case, we also have liberal variants of transformers. But now, liberality in the weakest pre-case meant divergence. Now it means unreachability. So these liberal transformers actually will only contain this third class, or additionally contain this third class of final states. So here's the demonic strongest liberal post, and here's the angelic strongest liberal post, which is also a new transformer. And yes, if we add them here, we get partial incorrectness for the demonic liberal variant and angelic partial incorrectness for this angelic liberal variant. And this means basically we do not require reachability, but if a final state is reachable, then it must be reachable from the precondition. Okay, then let's take one final look at this picture, because we can see here we have actually the same order of transformers that we had for the weakest pre cases, which again to these implications here. I said that the goal, our goal was to build kind of an exhaustive taxonomy. So we have now an over-approximation of a transformer here. So we can also over-approximate other transformers, right? For example, the angelic weakest pre. But it turns out this is actually, if we negate these conditions B and C, this is actually equivalent to partial correctness Hoare logic. So these are kind of contrapositive to each other, and we use these green dotted arrows to symbolize contrapositivity. So you can read this as an equivalence if we negate the conditions. And now we can also all other transformers, but it turns out they are actually all contrapositive to some logic that we've already seen, and we also have these implications between them. And we can do the same for the strongest post-transformers, but they are, we also have these implications, and they are also all contrapositive to some logic that we've already named or seen. Yeah. And now there's only one thing missing, which is this equivalence here, which is not so surprising because we had this equivalence, or this equivalence here and these two contrapositive relations. And we've also shown in the paper that these are the only two Galois equivalences in this paper, in the taxonomy, sorry. Okay, so now if we're looking at this picture, this looks very symmetric, right? We have this backward analysis part here and the forward analysis part here, and they look completely symmetric. But I've just said a few minutes ago that we have this asymmetry between forward and backward analysis because this branching divergence cannot exist in the forward case. So the question kind of is, where is it? Why do I not see this here? And to answer this, we're going to take a look at Kleene algebra. And I don't have time to go much into detail. I'll just give a very brief intuition on how we can use Kleene algebraic equations to express program properties. So think of a program as a relation of input and output states. So here's a program P. We can add a second program Q and compose those, which is just composition of the underlying relations. Then we have tests, which are subsets of the identity relation and represent, in this case, a precondition, so sets of states. We can also compose them, and we couldn't do the same for a postcondition. And now the resulting, the term BPQC contains the pairs 2, 2, and 3, 2. And now the clue with Kleene algebra with top and tests is that we have this top element, which is the universal relation. And if we append this to the term, this actually acts as a selector of the domain or the codomain of these terms, because we now get a relation that relates all initial states to this codomain of the previous relation that we had, which is something that we need to express incorrectness, for example. Okay, and now program properties are just equations over these terms. For example, here's an equation for partial correctness. And there is this relative recent result of an equation for incorrectness logic. We were also able to find one for partial incorrectness. And now, total correctness Hoare logic is known to be inexpressible in Kleene algebra. But we were able to find an equation for Lisbon logic, which is kind of cool because you see that these from a transformer perspective, Lisbon logic and total correctness Hoare logic are actually very related. So we were a bit surprised by this actually, but it was possible and we found an equation. And now if you look at these equations, they are syntactically very similar, right? And there are of course more equations that fit this pattern. For example, this one here or this one. The one on the bottom turned out to be equivalent to this new logic, angelic partial incorrectness, which is kind of cool because it seems that Kleene algebra in some sense agrees that this is a sensible logic to add to this taxonomy. And I want to spend a quick slide on the top one because what this means is that all computation that is started in this set of initial states B, either there exists a path reaching the postcondition or all paths must diverge. So this is kind of a mixture of this angelic demonic stuff that I've been talking about, right? And there's not a single transformer that captures this, but we can capture it using the union of two. And I won't have time to show you this now, but this actually fits quite nicely into this taxonomy. And there's also a kind of funny relation to outcome logic. So take a look into the paper if you're interested. And what I am going to show you now, though, is this taxonomy that we had before. And now here are the logics that are expressible in Kleene algebra. And now you see there's this gap up here, which is an asymmetry in this picture, which is kind of what we wanted, right? So this is very nice. Yeah, in the paper we also looked at like conditions that we can discharge so that logics collapse. for example, if the program terminates, we know that total correctness and partial correctness are equivalent. And this actually holds for several of these logics. So there are these axes along which program logics collapse under different assumptions. So we've looked at this here, for example, and also this appeared in the paper. Yeah, so this is quite cool because you see what logics you can use to prove other logics, on which tools you can combine potentially. And now there are many open questions still. For example, we have these equations for Kleene algebra with these equivalences between them. And it would be cool to see if we can find some kind of syntactic recipe to get from one equation to the other that represents this Galois connection. Other open questions include like variants of Kleene algebra, because we've only been looking at a very specific variant. Then another point that I want to mention is the names of these logics. I'd really like to find names for all of these logics that represent like all properties, all kind of properties that I can express. And yeah, there are many more open questions. I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to refer you to the paper for more illustrations and even larger taxonomy, and also a comparison to existing taxonomies. For example, the abstract interpretation one. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Very beautiful work. I guess I'm curious if you can go to the slide where the Kleene algebra breaks the symmetry. It's kind of puzzling because Kleene algebra, there is no notion of backward or forward, right? It's completely symmetric. It's just a relation. So how can that break the symmetry between forward and backward reasoning?
Yeah, interesting question. It's actually the reason for this gap up here. For the gap that you see, is actually this asymmetry of forward and backward analysis, because in program executions, like you cannot have this branching you can have a branching of divergence which cannot be captured by Kleene algebra. So why Kleene algebra is symmetric in some sense, like the underlying relation is not, because program execution is not symmetric, if that makes sense.
I guess maybe a follow-up question. If you would add, Kleene algebra has the star that does forward iteration. If you would have a star for backward iteration, you would express those two?
I'm not sure, because we're using this relational abstraction. Maybe I'd have to think about this in more detail. But it's an interesting thought. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, just to drone on about the connection to Kleene algebra. I think, so that connection, right, between these subset relations that you have and the equations, it goes a little bit further to the point where you can prove these equations, like you can relate these equations to rules of inference in propositional Hoare logic. Have you explored that connection as well? Like, are there rules of inference that you can validate using their Kleene algebra counterparts?
I have not looked into that, but it would definitely be interesting, in particular for these logics here, for these strongest post variants, because they are kind of new, and I wouldn't know how this looks in Hoare logics there.
Let's chat about that.
Yeah, let's do that.
We have time for one more question.
Could you get something about having, rather than pre and post condition, which are concrete pre and post condition, abstract post condition, and abstract precondition, so ranging in some abstraction? Does something of this taxonomy should be still there? I know it's very vague question, but maybe you have some idea.
I'm not sure how you would define abstractions of these pre and post conditions. I mean, there's this work on like a weakest hyper calculus. Maybe you could express something like this in here, and I suppose for the weakest pre-variance, at least it should hold. There are some problems with the strongest post in these in this area, but I'm not entirely sure. Maybe next year I'll give a talk about this in the hyper setting.
So let's thank the speaker again.